Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Lobbying 101 for Business Leaders, brought to you by NJBIA, Citizens Bank, Focus New Jersey, Manufacturing Counts, Minding Your Business, and the New Jersey Business Magazine, as well as our own podcast, Planet New Jersey. Hi, I'm Michelle Sakurka, President and CEO of New Jersey Business and Industry Association. It's absolutely my pleasure to welcome you this morning. Our presenters today are Chris Emmerholz, Chief Government Affairs Officer at NJBIA, and Rebecca Mulfried, Partner at K&L Gates. Now, a few housekeeping matters before we get started today. The webinar is being recorded and you will receive a copy of today's presentation as well as the deck that you'll see. So be on the lookout for that. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the chat box. We will be taking questions. We'll keep our eye on it. There'll be some natural pauses along the way for your questions, and we'll get to the others at the end. If for some reason we don't get to them all, we can answer after the fact. So with that, again, I want to welcome you all this morning, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris and Rebecca. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Thank you for taking the time out and trying to understand a little more about lobbying, a job that I have had for years and love, and I'm very proud to do it at NJBIA. And we have a great team of lobbyists that are trying to lobby on behalf of all of you to make New Jersey a little more business friendly. I'm going to start out talking about just some basics of BIA as your lobbyist, then turn it over to Rebecca Fried, who BIA is very, very lucky to have a chance to work with as one of the best there is on just the rules of lobbying. And it's important to understand maybe how to do it, but also how to do it right and follow the rules. And then at the end, I will kind of give you some examples of some BIA wins, BIA defeats, examples of lobbying so that you can see sort of what we're doing for all of you and some of the previous issues that we've lobbied on. So to kind of take a step back, I like to start talking about that there's three distinct types of lobbyists that I think it's important to understand how the process works. And all three are NJBIA members. So there's the contract lobbyist, and the contract lobbyist is almost the lobbyist that has the expertise in the process, but maybe not as much in a particular issue area. And they really work with whoever hires them. And so they have a set of clients, almost like a lawyer, and many contract lobbyists sometimes are lawyers, but not all of them. But they either, they're getting paid by the hour or paid to a retainer fee to basically lobby on behalf of that client. And they could be lobbying on behalf of clients in a host of different issues. And there are rules that obviously you can dive into the details, and Rebecca may touch upon them in terms of the different clients and the conflicts, but contract lobbyist is kind of that for-hire lobbyist. Then there's the corporate lobbyist, and BIA is blessed to work with a wide range of large corporations that are our members that have their government affairs or government relations or external people. And a lot of those are the point contact for BIA when we're working with all these large corporations. They only have one interest, and that's that company's. And so we are working with lobbyists in the pharmaceutical and the telecom and the utility and the manufacturing space. And all of these lobbyists might care about HR issues, might care about tax issues, might care about energy environment issues, healthcare, education, you name it. But they're only focused on what's best for that company. And so we are working with them because those companies are our BIA members. And then third, the lobbyist that I am, association lobbyist. And so association lobbyists, BIA is one of the larger teams in Trenton of association lobbyists. And I'll introduce that team in a second, just with who they are and what they do. But it's kind of, we represent businesses, the thousands of businesses across the state that make up NJBIA, and we lobby on behalf of them. It's not one client, it's thousands of clients, but we try to do our best to make sure we are representing all of them, the business community. There's other associations that represent all of the restaurants in the state, all the food stores in the state, all the utility companies in the state, all the pharmaceutical companies in the state. And we work closely with a lot of those business associations to advocate for pro-business policies. But associations is kind of, you're going to be a little broader. You're going to be a little more public facing sometimes. If you're a contract lobbyist, corporate lobbyist, you might not be testifying as much on legislation. You might not be in the public eye. You might not be putting your name on op-eds as much. A lot of times they're working behind the scenes. The associations, we want to be the face of the business community. Another association might want to be the face of some other special interest. And so I think those are the three kinds of lobbyists that we see often in the halls of the State House, often at political events around the state. And the association lobbyist is often who NJBIA works the closest with. So BIA is one of the largest association lobbyists in New Jersey. Our client is the business community and the thousands of businesses that make us up. Trenton is where we mostly focus upon. Washington, D.C. is a sometimes focus, and I say more lately because over the past couple months, I think we've never gotten more calls about federal issues than we have recently with what's going on in D.C. and things being rather different than they used to be. And every once in a while, we get involved in local issues, county issues, city issues. And obviously, there's some different rules that Rebecca will lay out when it comes to Trenton and federal and local. But mostly, I'm working, and our team at BIA is working with 120 legislators that make up our Senate and Assembly, working with the governor's office, working with the executive branch, and all the executive branch entities that have rulemaking authority. So that is mostly our target for lobbying. So interestingly, every year, the Election Law Enforcement Commission, where BIA has to report to, and Rebecca is going to talk about that in a little bit, puts out data. So in 2024, there was $103 million spent in total New Jersey lobbying expenditures. BIA was the fourth highest special interest spender in that group, but you could see only $643,792 of that $103 million. So a lot of people are engaged, a lot of people are spending a lot of money. And most of that is going to the BIA team to make sure that that team is running around the state advocating for all of you. But just I think that helps put a little context into what we're talking about. Can we advance to the next slide, please? So the lobbying team, we're blessed. In addition to overseeing our team, I handle tax, economic development, manufacturing, and innovation issues for the association. Ray Cantor is handling our energy, environment, transportation, legal issues. Althea Ford handles our workforce development, healthcare, consumer affairs issues. And Elissa Frank handles our labor and insurance issues. We are blessed to have people that have backgrounds in these areas and have expertise in these areas. And BIA tries very, very hard, and everybody has a different approach to lobbying, but BIA tries very hard to follow the data and research to pursue what we think is a policy balance. And we try to have that expertise in all these different areas, whether it's my expertise on tax issues, because I used to staff the Senate Budget Committee, Ray's expertise on energy environment, because he used to work for the Department of Environmental Protection and also staff the Environment Committee for the Office of Legislative Services in the legislature. So we have people that are experts here, but with that expertise, we don't want to just lead because we've heard this is the right thing, or the politicians are saying it's the right thing, or one party's doing this, one party's doing that. No, we look at what the data says, what the research says, and then BIA's big mantra, and we say it all the time, and I think there's some legislators that laugh at it, is we try to pursue balance. We know New Jersey is never going to be an inexpensive state or the least regulated state in the country, but can we just not be the worst? And so that is our overriding mantra, is looking at the data and the research, what that says, and let's not be an extreme on either end, on the far right or the far left. We also follow the levers of change. And what I mean by that is where is the power? Where is the authority? Where are the decisions going to be made? And what BIA does with this, and I think a good lobbyist does, is we should never take any of these levers for granted. So if there's a bill up in committee, we're going to talk to, obviously, the sponsor of that bill, the chairman of that committee, but every member of that committee, if it's a big bill, is going to hear from us. They're going to get email communication from us. They're going to get text from us. We don't take for granted that the Republicans are in the minority and we don't need to talk to them. No, we're going to talk to the Republicans. We don't take for granted that it's just the chairman and the sponsor. No, we're going to talk to leadership. We're going to talk to staff. We're going to make sure the other house that if it's a bad bill that we don't want to see move, the other house knows how bad it is before they start thinking about it if the one house is taking it up in committee. So we want to make sure everybody hears about it. We want to make sure the executive branch and governor's office, we want all the different perspectives taken in. Then we're also going to work the press. And we have a great press shop at BIA. And I think this probably sets us aside sometimes in our lobbying efforts in terms of lobbying the press, in terms of making sure that they're hearing from us. They're getting our press releases. We're doing op-eds. We're reaching out. So, and the last thing that we follow is we follow the rules. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to start to get into some of the rules of lobbying. But I also think this pause is probably a good chance to maybe take any questions about anything I mentioned just as we started this off. Anything going on? Questions about BIA's lobbying efforts?
Yeah, Chris, thank you. We do have one question here. You mentioned areas of expertise for yourself and Ray. What about Althea and Alyssa's professional experience?
Yes. So Althea, we're very lucky that she has actually a master's degree in education from an Ivy League university. Alyssa Frank used to work for a labor law firm before she came and did labor law for us. And so I think, again, we have a whole team. For the sake of time, didn't run through everybody, but just kind of went through a couple names. But all of our team has expertise and is developing expertise. We pride ourselves in sending people out to the appropriate conferences, being part of the appropriate associations outside of just New Jersey, that where they can learn about what their issues are and stay up to date on the latest. So no, we're very lucky to have a great team, Alyssa, Althea, Ray, and I'm lucky to oversee that great team. So yeah, good question.
Thank you, Chris.
There are no other questions. I will jump in. As Chris and Michelle mentioned, I'm Rebecca Freed. I'm a partner at K&L Gates. I'm here in our Newark, New Jersey office. Just by quick way of background, I'm in our government contracts and procurement policy group, also our U.S. political law group. So I am not a registered lobbyist, but I spend a lot of my time helping people who are registered, companies with registered lobbyists, and just organizations and companies who are engaging in the political and policy process, making sure that they comply with the rules. So my job today is really to give you a high-level overview so you understand some of the basics in terms of what is lobbying in New Jersey, and how you really draw some of those distinctions. And I know sometimes compliance can seem boring or one more thing that you have to think about and put on your plate. But what I always tell people is you want to be able to really jump in, focus on the policy. You don't want to get caught up in not complying with the law, because obviously you can get in trouble for that. It can cause reputation issues and then take up a lot of your time and distract from what you're really trying to accomplish. So starting off, what is lobbying in New Jersey? And I know Chris talked about, obviously, focus on lobbying in New Jersey, some at the federal level. For those of you that have companies or a presence in other states, just keep in mind that there are similarities among statewide laws, but there are also variations. So New Jersey law regulates lobbying at the executive and legislative branches of government. What I think is a little unique about New Jersey, and I feel like we always seem to do things in a little bit of a unique way, and I mean that in the nicest way ever. I'm a Jersey girl born and bred, but the person engaged in lobbying in New Jersey is not called a lobbyist. They are called a governmental affairs agent, so GAA for short. So it's important to understand that distinction. The company or the entity that's hiring the government affairs agent is actually considered the lobbyist. So that sometimes is a little bit tricky, but that's our term of art. In New Jersey, local communications are not subject to the state lobbying law. And I know Chris mentioned that sometimes BIA will get involved on the local level and some issues are local. What you want to keep in mind in terms of engaging on the local level, although it's not subject to our statewide lobbying law, and we don't have a statewide law that covers local lobbying communications, some counties and municipalities, it's very rare, but have adopted their own lobbying rules. I know, for example, just based on experience, that Jersey City, for example, has a local lobbying registration requirement. Some counties and municipalities, if you are involved in the government contracting process, may ask you as part of that process when you're submitting proposals whether you have engaged in any lobbying at that level of government to try to influence the government contract. So just keep this in mind. There are variations, and it's important to stop and think at what level of government are you looking to communicate. Next slide, please. So who is a governmental affairs agent? What you really want to think about is not everybody who communicates with somebody in government needs to register as a governmental affairs agent. Chris talked about the NJBIA lobbying team. Not every person who works at NJBIA or potentially provides support to that team needs to register as a governmental affairs agent. In New Jersey, We look at a person who's compensated and spends more than 20 hours in a calendar year. That includes prep and travel to influence legislation, regulation, or a governmental process by communicating with or providing a benefit to a high-level state official. So that is really the starting point. You know, if you think, am I engaging in lobbying? Is someone on my team engaging in lobbying? The key here is really to start to track those hours, because what I found in working with companies in this space, sometimes a company doesn't want to have to register as a lobbyist. You know, and Chris talked about all the great work that BIA does. You may feel, you know what, we want our lobbying as part of a member of BIA to go through that, but maybe sometimes we want to have a communication just on behalf of our company. Track that time, because it's going to tell you ultimately if you cross that 20-hour threshold, if you're getting close to it, whether you're going to have to register, or maybe if you don't want to, having to take a step back and not communicate anymore. And it's also important from a compliance perspective to track, because if a question ever comes up, you know, hey, you know, we think so-and-so at company Y should be registered and reporting to ELAC, they're not. And ELAC has questions about that, which I think would be rare, but you never know. You want to be able to say, no, this person didn't have to register. We've been tracking, and here's why. When you think about communicating, that includes oral and written communications. I'm not too concerned about a quick comment here or there, but certainly if you're having lengthier conversations, emails, phone calls, text messages, you know, those would all fall within the definition of communicating. Providing a benefit to includes making any expenditure for entertainment, food, beverage, travel, lodging, you see honoraria, gifts, loans, or other things of value. So you really want to be looking at all of this and really think about it. How are you interacting with elected and appointed officials? And I always recommend every company, every organization, you should have a standalone policy or a section in your code of conduct that regulates interactions with government and elected officials. It's important to really set the stage and expectations. It's also important to the extent that somebody within the organization isn't following the rules or doing what they're supposed to do, that helps protect you. And exceptions do exist under the law for support personnel and attendance at meetings in the presence of a registered governmental affairs agent. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please.
And Rebecca, just just to I guess explain a point there. I think a good one is BIA. Yeah, I mentioned the 4 registered lobbyists we have. We also have, you heard from Michelle at the top, is also a registered government affairs agent in New Jersey. Not that it's her primary job. She's our president and CEO, but she does spend a considerable amount of time because BIA focuses on government affairs. And so she spends enough time that the association feels that it's important to have our president and CEO as a registered government affairs agent. Not all associations will be like that. If you're an association that doesn't focus much on government affairs or nonprofit that doesn't focus much on government affairs, maybe you have a contract lobbyist, as I mentioned, on retainer that's just a little bit of work for you, and you don't have anybody internally that you have to register. But I think BIA has the president, CEO, and then our whole government affairs team, except for our support personnel, as you mentioned. There's an exception there.
No, thanks, Chris. And I think that is a good point. So, you know, as you're thinking about it in terms of associations you're involved in terms of your own company, not everybody thinks, some people may think, well, our president and CEO, they're the president and CEO of the company or an association. We don't need to register them. But that's a great point, Chris. You want to look at each person individually and what they are doing. And sometimes what I found in working with companies or organizations, you want to streamline the process. Maybe you say, if you're a smaller company, all of our lobbying is going to be done through an outside organization. Or maybe you say we're going to have one person register, but you want to be mindful of that 20-hour rule, because you don't want to find yourselves in a situation where you have no strategy, no compliance plan. And the next thing you know, you have to register 10 different people because they're all running around doing their own thing. I think that's obviously can be a compliance risk. And sometimes that's counterproductive to messaging too, because, you know, Chris will talk a little bit about this, but obviously BIA has a really great strategy. You know, they do a lot of research, everything is well thought out. And sometimes I know within companies that I've worked with, someone may think, oh, I know this person in the executive branch or the legislature, I'm going to have a conversation. But to the extent everything isn't going through registered lobbyists or government affairs agents, it sometimes can be counterproductive to what goals you're trying to achieve. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. So what is lobbying in New Jersey? You know, direct lobbying, I think everybody really intuitively understands, is communicating with a high-level state official in an attempt, whether it's successful or not, to influence legislation, regulation, or a governmental process. And I'll go through what each of those terms means in a little more detail in a moment. Grassroots lobbying is also considered lobbying in New Jersey, and that's communicating with the general public in an attempt to influence legislation or regulation. Many associations and groups, I know BIA has done this in the past too, if there's a really important issue, sometimes it's not necessarily just a matter of communicating with those in the executive or legislative branch. Sometimes you really want to be able to educate the public, have a call to action. And that's where grassroots lobbying comes in. There are different rules that apply there. And due to, I want to say recent changes in the law, but it's been now 2 years since the Election Transparency Act took effect in New Jersey. There's also a broader definition now of independent expenditures, where the closer you get to an election, certain messaging, even if it's focused on issues, can sometimes be viewed as political activity. So that's not the focus of today, but you know, you just want to keep that in mind too, in terms of having a well thought out plan and strategy. I know BIA does that to the extent your companies are thinking you want to jump in or dive in. It's really important to understand these different buckets and make sure that activity and tracking falls within the right bucket. Next slide, please. Oh, go ahead, Chris. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, thank you, Rebecca. Sorry. Just on the grassroots side, I mentioned the levers of change. Obviously, when a legislator is voting yes or no on a bill that we either want to advance or want to slow down, we're definitely talking to them. But the grassroots side, I know probably some of you on this Zoom have attended a NJBIA ELC breakfast or lunch around the state at times, where BIA is giving the legislative update to educate BIA members and the business community at large about a particular issue. And that education, that hosting these breakfasts, we want to educate enough people, and maybe they're reaching out to their legislators saying something is either a good bill or a bad bill, and that's lobbying. It's not necessarily talking to the guy that's going to vote yes or no, or talking to the person that's going to issue the regulation or not issue the regulation, but we hope to educate enough people so that we're starting to make change at the grassroots level, which sometimes is more important change to make. So a lot of BIA events could also fall into that lobbying category.
Thanks, Chris. So before I get into these technical definitions, which are going to be pretty simple and streamlined, because when you look at the definitions under the law, it's like you're just looking at terms that are defined with more terms. So you'll see the definitions are pretty basic, but I think that's the easiest way to digest them. But you have to understand who is considered a high-level state official, because those are the individuals that you're communicating with, where those communications could potentially be considered lobbying. So we're looking at the governor and lieutenant governor and their staff, the legislature and legislative staff, high-level executive branch officials. You can see those are usually department and agency heads, commissioners, assistant commissioners, chiefs of staff, executive directors. And then there's really a catch-all under the law, a policy advisor or a person in an analogous position to the titles above, or any person empowered by law to issue, adopt, or promulgate administrative rules. So that's really what you have to be thinking about in terms of who are you communicating with when you're thinking about, is this potentially lobbying? Next slide, please. So what is lobbying? Influencing legislation. I think this is what everybody thinks about when they think about lobbying. So it includes making any attempt, again, whether you're successful or not, to secure or prevent the initiation of any legislation or the passage, defeat, amendment, or modification of legislation. So that's the most basic, I think, and intuitive form of lobbying. As you'll see on the next slide, the definition also includes influencing regulation. That again includes making any attempt, and I'll say it again, whether you're successful or not, to secure or prevent the proposal of any regulation, or the consideration, amendment, issuance, promulgation, adoption, or rejection of a regulation. Comments on rulemaking are a form of lobbying. I've been doing this for a long time now. I've been conducting a lot of trainings for clients recently. And I think the rulemaking piece is one where people still somewhat get hung up in terms of, are we lobbying? And when you think about comments on rulemaking, I think this is really a great place, and I don't know if Chris will want to chime in, where you see groups like NJBIA really playing a very important role. Because we obviously have the legislation that often gets passed and codified into statute. The regulations are supposed to provide more detail on that. And the comment period on regulations is really a time for the business community and others to provide comments to the relevant administrative agency on how this law may actually work. And what I found too, where sometimes if you're not sure, what do they really mean by a particular law or regulation, you can go and look at those comments on rulemaking, and that often provides really good insight, sometimes into changes or how the regulation was intended to apply. But comments on rulemaking, I think, is often a time, and Chris, I'm curious what you think, where I've seen businesses really more inclined to be with an association or a business and industry group rather than to be standing out there on their own commenting on regulations.
No, that's a fantastic point, Rebecca. And it's something that I know some of our members are very reliant upon us for. And they don't want to, they might have a very unique thing that their business is doing in their business model, and they might not want to divulge that to whatever department. So right now I am involved in hundreds of pages of corporate tax regulations, which is not something anybody wants to be diving into. And thankfully, we have a lot of fantastic tax attorneys, accountants, corporations that have tax departments that are great to work with. And together we have a coalition that are diving into the weeds of the latest proposed regulations govern our corporate business tax. And it's one of the examples I was going to raise before, but at the end of the session. But I think that's where together we put all of our heads together and we say, hey, this is the comments that we want to provide back, and we're going to provide the official comments. One of the nice things about, I guess, a little sidebar on lobbying advocacy, the regulatory effort from the Treasury Department is, I think, a little bit more inclusive and transparent than others, and they provide something called the advance notice process. And the advance notice rules come out before the official Administrative Procedures Act sort of official proposal. And the unofficial rule they send to some of the stakeholders. So they send it to BIA, they send it to some other people that are very involved. And we take that and we then provide comments, and we can then see when they actually officially propose the rule that they actually listen to some of our advance notice comments, and some they didn't. We're going to ask for the same thing again, but it's important to kind of use that coalition of all the experts. And I think Treasury, and I'm sure other state departments, they know that there's some tax experts out there that know more about tax than they do in the Treasury Department, and they might learn something and they might say, hey, you know what? They raised the BIA, the state chamber raised a good point. Maybe we should say it this way because it's more clear and it'd be going to avoid future litigation. And I know there's some lawyers out there that like the future litigation, but if we can avoid and save a few dollars for some businesses out there, then that's worthwhile. So I think it is a good back and forth process, the regulatory process. It's often a lot more complicated, and you're looking at hundreds of pages of rules instead of a 10 or 15 page bill. But sometimes it's more important.
No, thanks. So I think that is a good point. I mean, I think, in terms of the regulated community, I think that there is nothing more frustrating when there's some, a regulation that's vague and no one's quite sure what to do to comply. So I think that oftentimes that the more the business community and those with expertise are looking or involved, I think at the end of the day, that makes better regulations and it makes it easier for everybody, I think, including, the lawyers, because I know in working with clients, it's really frustrating when you're reading a regulation over and over again and you're not quite sure what you're supposed to do with it, in terms of telling somebody how to comply. So next slide, please. Another form of lobbying in New Jersey, and this was a newer addition, but it's not even so new anymore because it goes back to like the early 2000s. So I guess that's just, a warped version of time. But influencing a governmental process is also considered lobbying. And again, that includes any attempt, whether it's successful or not, to communicate or secure information related to a governmental process. So that includes the promulgation of executive orders, rate setting, which is very important, obviously, to those regulated communities that are before the BPU, the development, negotiation, award, modification, or cancellation of public contracts. So for those of you who are participating today, if your companies are involved in government contracting in New Jersey and you are contracting with the state or a state university or state hospital or state authority, and you're looking to try to influence that outside of your proposal, that is considered lobbying. And I will say, in some circumstances, it's absolutely prohibited. So you need to take a look at every RFP to which you're responding to understand what are the rules of the road in terms of communicating once that RFP has been issued. The issuance, denial, modification, renewal, revocation, or suspension of permits, licenses, or waivers, procedures for bidding or purchasing, impositions of fines and penalties, rendition of administrative determinations. You're dealing with award, denial, modification, renewal, or termination of financial assistance, grants, and loans. That's all considered a governmental process. Next slide, please. And the list still goes on a bit. I think this is the broadest category, but what you need to be thinking about is that not every communication is considered lobbying. However, and this goes back to the earlier point about tracking time, tracking those 20 hours a year, once a person is registered as a governmental affairs agent, there is a rebuttable presumption of lobbying. So in that regard, I told you that I am not a registered lobbyist. We know that Chris is, we know that Michelle is, to the extent, let's just say for some reason, NJBIA is working on an issue. Maybe I have a client that's very concerned with the same issue. Chris and I could potentially have the same conversation with the same person in, let's just say, the executive branch or the legislature. And as long as I'm under those 20 hours in a year, my communication is not considered lobbying. That being said, once somebody is registered, not every time they correspond with somebody is it going to be considered lobbying, but the default is treating an activity as lobbying. So that's why it's really important for your own companies, own organizations. Think about who is registered, how many people you register, and who is having what communication. The law also provides some express carve-outs, which I'll go through on the next slide, from the definition of lobbying. So you can see here, if you're publishing a news item or editorial in the ordinary course of business, not lobbying. If a government employee is carrying out official duties, that's not considered lobbying. When somebody is testifying on legislation or regulations and they're not compensated for it and they make no other communication related to that testimony, it's not considered lobbying. And sometimes you may see this from members of the public who may be very vested in a particular issue, may have personal experience related to that. They're not required to to register as a government affairs agent if that's their only form of lobbying. When you are responding to a detailed request for information from the government, you receive a subpoena. If there's a public emergency or condition that involves public health or safety, and you have to communicate with the government, I know, like in talking with many utilities, if there's an issue in that regard, let's say we lose power, water pipes burst, and you're dealing with a public emergency, that's not considered lobbying if you're trying to deal with that public emergency and communicate with the government in that regard. When you participate in an RFP process and you go through the traditional bid process, or attend a bid conference, for example, that's not considered lobbying. But remember, look at that RFP, because if you have other conversations on the side trying to influence that process, whether as a company or you hire, a government affairs agent to do that for you, that's lobbying. When you respond to an audit, not lobbying. Next slide, please. And you'll see here there are some other examples. Communicating on a routine ministerial matter. And the easiest way to think about this, you can see the list, but basically you're not seeking any preferential treatment or the alteration of a decision. You simply want to know how the current law is being applied or enforced. You want to understand how a process works. That's not considered lobbying. And then certain business matters are not considered lobbying either. If you're providing advice or performing services pursuant to an existing government contract, if you are, as I mentioned, requesting information, trying to figure out how to comply with the law, if you're participating in an inspection required by law. Some limited sales communications are not considered lobbying, but for those of you with sales teams, you want to be very careful at what point you're crossing the line and you're really trying to influence the government's decision to purchase goods or services from you. Inquiries about the delivery of services or materials pursuant to an existing contract. So what I'd say for those who do hold government contracts, look at those contracts, look at your responsibilities and obligations. And if you're really interacting in a way that fits within the four corners of that document, it would not be considered lobbying, but you want to be careful. Next slide, please. And it still goes on. So communicating with or providing a benefit to a high-level state official if it constitutes personal expression. Now, this is something you want to be really careful about. You know, New Jersey is a small state. I feel like everyone in a lot of spaces tends to know one another. I think you find, you know, people could now be in the executive branch or the legislature who could be a childhood friend, a college roommate. You know, what does that look like? When there's a form of personal expression and you're paying for something with your own funds, you're not being reimbursed in any way, and it's not incident to your employment, you know, that wouldn't necessarily be considered a lobbying activity that's covered, but you want to be careful. Even if someone is your childhood best friend, if you are part of a company that's always consistently doing business with the government or appearing before the legislature, you don't want to give any elected or appointed official or government employee lavish gifts, you know, and there are gift rules and entertainment. If anyone has questions about that, happy to jump in at another point. But you want to understand that and remember, appearances also matter. If you participate in a task force, advisory board, or working group, that's not considered lobbying, but it's a very narrow exception. So you want to make sure that this task force or advisory group or working group was specifically established pursuant to a statute or by the head of a principal department in state government, that you've been invited or nominated to participate, and you're receiving no separate compensation for service. So again, narrow exception, but it is out there. Next slide, please. And we're just about wrapping up on what is not considered lobbying. When you're dealing with a governmental process, you know, communications that are subject to attorney-client privilege are not considered lobbying. So you may have a lawyer that's working with you, representing you. That lawyer may also be a registered lobbyist. So it's understanding when is the attorney acting in the role of an attorney, you know, trying to handle a legal matter versus lobbying. Collective negotiations is not considered lobbying. And then again, you know, this attorney exception when you're representing a client in routine litigation, administrative proceeding, or a quasi-judicial, civil, or administrative proceeding with the state. So it's understanding sometimes if someone's wearing more than one hat, what hat they're wearing. So I'll pause there just to see if there are any questions or if Chris wants to jump in at all before we move on to the next slide.
No, I don't need to jump in. I think that was very helpful, Rebecca. And I think you spend a lot of time on what's not lobbying, and it almost seems, hey, this is lobbying 101. But I think because there's advocacy and there's representing your members and your clients and representing your own business, and then there's lobbying, and we want to make sure we follow the rules for lobbying. But that doesn't mean there's things that BIA does, there's things that we all do that are communicating and dealing with government that are not necessarily lobbying and don't have to trigger all of the rules that are important to follow. But so yeah, I think talking about what are normal course of business kind of things that are not necessarily triggering the use of a government affairs agent is important.
Right, and I think it looks like we have a question in the chat, right, Lee?
Yes, we do. There have been a lot of town hall meetings about the disparity study released by the state of New Jersey last year. Would calls to action during the meetings constitute grassroots lobbying activities?
I mean, I think that they could potentially, what happens from that. I think it's kind of in terms of at the town hall meetings, who's at those meetings, what's being discussed. Are the people who are there with these calls for action, potentially calling upon people in that room in a specific way to take action. So I think I see that Philando was the one who asked that question, happy to chat and delve in a little bit deeper offline. I'll say that facts and circumstances matter. So I think in situations for that, for groups that are at town hall meetings that are trying to have some kind of call to action, I think it's important to understand the strategy going in. Are you okay with the fact that this may be considered grassroots lobbying that's reportable? Or if you'd prefer not to have activity fall in that category, can messaging and communications be crafted in a way so that it's not considered lobbying? So I'd be happy. I think that's one, I feel like that's a typical lawyer answer. It could be, it may not be, but I think when it comes to lobbying, what I found in working with a lot of organizations and corporations, again, the facts and circumstances matter, and it comes down to the overall strategy. As I mentioned, and I know as Chris talked about, NJBIA has a very well thought out strategy. And I think for anybody who's looking to get involved in policy work, if you're going through NJBIA or another organization that you're a part of, it's understanding what is their strategy. If you're looking to do this on your own, you can't just kind of jump in and throw things out there. You want a well thought out strategy.
Yeah, I think, Berlanda, that's an excellent question because one, it's an important issue, and BIA spent some time on it. And I guess just to give you the explanation of the way BIA is treated it. So obviously, we have talked about that disparity study and the abysmal numbers in it that need to be improved by our state. Internally, doesn't have to be lobbying, but if I'm in a meeting where they're talking about the bills that would help address that, I'm generally counting that in my lobbying numbers that get reported to the state. And then certainly if I am meeting with, I know Assemblywoman Sumter and Assemblyman, now Senator Wimberly, put forward some bills that try to address it. And when I worked on those bills and met with them, 100% that's lobbying. I don't know if everyone is as quick to report something as a lobbying hour as BIA, but I think it's better to err on the side of being cautious with that. And so if I'm in a meeting and we're talking about a bill to address something, I count that. If we're just actually reading it and learning about the issue and doing the research, maybe not. And that's where it's fact sensitive, as Rebecca said.
I think that's a great point, Chris. And I think there's certainly never a problem with over disclosing and over reporting. And I also think one of the things to keep in mind in this space, Chris talked about obviously mentioning a certain bill. With grassroots lobbying, there's normally mention of a certain bill and a call to action. There's also issue advocacy, which does, which focuses more on educating the public about particular issues. But even with that, you have to be careful, particularly, in terms of where are you having those communications? Who are they going to? Like, you can't try to say, well, I don't really want to be a registered lobbyist, so I'm going to talk about this bill, but not name the bill, but do everything else so it's obvious. So I think that that's also one thing to think about in this space. Appearances matter, reputation matters, and sometimes over disclosure just to be safe is the way to go. And I think, was there another question, Wayne?
There is, Rebecca. Are legislators required to disclose publicly all meetings with lobbyists?
So no, so the reporting in terms of this, it's on the lobbyists. So in terms of when we're not really getting into what reporting lobbyists need to do, that's, I feel like, a little bit detailed and painful. And, but the way that we look at this is when somebody is a registered governmental affairs agent and they're registered with the Election Law Enforcement Commission, that individual is responsible for filing quarterly reports. The next quarterly reports are actually due tomorrow, April 10th. And that's really the individual's activity report. So it shows, who are they communicating with? Generally, what is the topic? And then there's an annual lobbying report where the represented entity will show all expenditures by that entity and the registered lobbyist. In terms of members of the legislature, they are required to file financial disclosure reports every year. So they're going to have to disclose if they're receiving gifts or other benefits. So I don't know, Chris, if you have any additional thoughts on that, but the obligation really is on the government affairs agent to report the communications and activity.
Yeah, so I'm going to mention it in a bit when we talk about some examples, but the state budget is the most lobbied item of the year when you actually look at the ELEC reports, because there's so many things in the state budget that somebody may be working on. And so all of those different registered government affairs agencies around the state, they're reporting to ELEC that they're working on the budget. So right now I'm in the middle, it's budget season. I'm in the middle of meeting with legislators around the state, everybody on the budget committee, Democrats and Republicans, all the appropriate staff, everybody in leadership. And so you'll be able to see on NJBIA's ELEC report all of the time that we put in on the state budget. But in terms of that, I met at 12 p.m. in North Jersey with a North Jersey senator. Yeah, that necessarily is not there.
Great.
Next slide, please. Okay, so some scenarios, what is lobbying? This is a question I often receive. Do employees who attend a fundraiser or a charity event and chat with an elected official while there need to register as a lobbyist? Does it matter what topics are discussed? So you always want to keep this 20-hour registration threshold in mind. If you are someone within your organization is someone who's out and about in this space, is communicating, track those hours. I think it's very helpful in terms of determining whether you may need to register, or if a question comes up, why aren't you registered? Remember that once you are a registered governmental affairs agent, there is a rebuttable presumption of lobbying. So if you engage in a communication with a covered individual and it's not lobbying and you don't report it, you have to keep some kind of record as to why you didn't. You don't put on a report, I communicated with so-and-so and this isn't lobbying, but you want that out there. And then you need to think about, what are you talking about? Are you trying to influence legislation, regulation, or a governmental process? If Chris is at a political fundraiser or a charity event and he sees a member of the legislature, that he knows he's going to be meeting with, and just has a conversation about, kids and family and what's going on in New Jersey, and may even briefly say, oh, hey, we're looking forward to meeting with you about this bill. I'm not concerned that Chris needs to report that. But if Chris says that, and then the member of the legislature says, oh, you know what, I have a few minutes now and would really help me. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you're looking to accomplish? And then Chris gets into that discussion in a little more detail. That's something I would err on the side of caution and treat as lobbying. But certainly every time you attend a political fundraiser or a charity event and see an elected or government official there and have a conversation, that does not have to be tracked as lobbying. So I don't know, Chris, if you have any more thoughts on this real world scenario.
No, I think it's an important one to think about. And again, just as important as you were saying, what's not lobbying is when do you trigger that threshold to report something or not. Obviously, if you're a BIA and our team is spending most of their Mondays and Thursdays when the legislature meets in the State House, and obviously it's a no-brainer, and we're going to these political events with the intended purpose of advocating for our businesses. But what I see, and I'm sure there's a number of you on the Zoom right now, nonprofit members of BIA that not nonprofits many times are advocating for the cleanup of a creek or advocating for some social policy that they think the government needs to do a better job of, and they're providing services, they're providing advocacy and education. So I see sometimes they get caught up because they're not lobbyists, they're not spending their whole days in the State House, but do they hit the 20 hours? Do they are they trying to influence legislation, regulation, government processes? And I know over the years sometimes there's been nonprofits where we saw them in the State House a lot, and yet, oh, I'm a nonprofit, I don't need to register. And we obviously it's not our job to enforce these rules; it's the job of ELEC. But I would just make sure that you guys are careful, because I've seen some nonprofits get in trouble over the years where they're doing more direct lobbying and they're still kind of hiding behind that they're a nonprofit. And I wouldn't want any nonprofit member of BIA to get in trouble, because sometimes that is it just advocacy, regular advocacy, or is this lobbying? BIA tries to be cautious and err on the side of more reporting, but yeah, hopefully all of you guys are careful and doing the right thing.
And I think that's a great point with nonprofits and particularly 501c3 charitable organizations. And for those 501c3s in the call today, in addition to New Jersey's rules, you also have to keep IRS standards in mind, because when it comes to a 501c3 in particular, lobbying cannot be your primary purpose. It cannot be a substantial part of your activities. And there are different rules that apply, to 501c3s. So a 501c3 that's a private foundation cannot lobby, but a public charity can. And it's often a very useful tool. And I've worked, Chris, with a number of nonprofits in recent years, just trying to understand, do we need to register in New Jersey? This is what we're doing. This is what we're saying. And how does this factor in terms of IRS standards? Because if you are a 501c3 and if you end up engaging in too much lobbying activity by IRS standards, you can face fines and penalties, potentially lose your 501c3 status, which obviously you don't want to happen. So, if any 501c3s have questions, that's a little bit more detail, but I think a great point to highlight. And I think, was there another question that just popped up?
Yes, Rebecca, thank you. So I apologize if you went over this already, but does the amount of time spent drafting public comments on proposed regulations count towards the 20 hours? Example, would someone who spends 4 hours each drafting 5 rules comments in a year need to register? What about if each of the proposal comments is for a different client?
So I think that's a great question. And the answer is going to be, it depends on who's doing that drafting. So if somebody who is doing the drafting is a registered governmental affairs agent, or is somebody who's doing drafting and is also having these high-level communications, you certainly would have to track that prep time, and it would be 20 hours in a year, even if it was 5 on these comments, 5 on those. As we mentioned earlier, we didn't go into great detail. There is an exception under the law for support personnel. Those are individuals that are providing support to registered governmental affairs agents. Those could be staff that's researching policy, drafting comments. Those could be lawyers, whether in-house or outside counsel that you hire. And if those individuals are just really doing the research and drafting, but they are not actually having any communications, or they're not the ones signing and submitting the regulations, they're considered support personnel. They do not have to register as governmental affairs agents. However, to the extent that they spend more than 450 hours in a year of all their time focused on providing this support, on the organization's annual lobbying report, you would have to report that time and the money spent on that. So that, again, based on that question, is to the extent you're engaging in all these activities, you want to think about who is doing what category they fall in, and also understand ultimately that the person who is signing those regulation comments is considered engaging in lobbying. So one good takeaway is, if you as a company are submitting comments on regulations, make sure whoever is signing those and submitting is registered as a governmental affairs agent. And I don't know, Chris, if you have anything to add to that based on real world experience.
No, I think you covered it well.
Thanks. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, do business leaders who attend meetings with executive and legislative branch officials and staff need to register as a lobbyist? So this is what you want to be thinking about. If you go along to a meeting and you are a business leader, if you have technical expertise on something, what are you doing at that meeting? Are you speaking? If you're speaking at the meeting, what are you being asked to speak about? Are you trying to influence something? Or are you there, let's just say if it's an environmental issue, to provide technical information to the members of the government about what is going on? Are you already a registered governmental affairs agent? Remember the rebuttable presumption. If you are and you're attending that meeting, what you're saying when you're speaking, that would most likely be considered lobbying, unless you're talking about nothing related to anything that would be considered influencing legislation, regulation, or a governmental process. If you are not a registered governmental affairs agent, are you attending in the company of one? There is a shield, which is very important. So you need to be thinking about that. So if, for example, Chris is attending, certain meetings and he says, I'm going to bring along a few members of NJBIA because I think they really provide great technical advice, and experience about what we're trying to accomplish here. If you are not registered, if you're speaking in a technical role and you are attending with Chris reports that lobbying activity, not you. So you need to be thinking about that. Again, what is being discussed at the meeting, and you see the technical or expert advice. So that's another exception under the rules. And that's important, again, to think about with overall strategy and mapping things out. Because if you just show up to a meeting on your own, not with a registered governmental affairs agent, and even if you're talking about technical advice, but you're trying to influence this process, that generally would be considered lobbying. I think there was another question.
Yes, there was, Rebecca. As a Chamber of Commerce, we appreciate all that NJBIA does on our behalf. We often sign on to many of the letters that NJBIA sends to legislators. We do not directly lobby or discuss specific laws. By our classification as a 501c6 nonprofit, it is defined as chambers of commerce. A board of trade usually promote the common economic interest of all the commercial enterprises in a given trade community. How does this fall into the registration areas? Staff members fall under the 20-hour threshold.
No, I think that's a good question. And I think some of that would have to really depend on what is the content of the letter. I think if NJBIA, if everything is being done through NJBIA and NJBIA is the one, reporting the activity as lobbying and saying these organizations agree or sign on, I wouldn't worry about that as being considered reportable lobbying. And I think some of it, if it gets more detailed or separate communications are being sent, then I think we would look at that potentially differently. So I don't know, Chris, depending on how this works in practice, whether you want to chime in at all.
No, I think you said it well. I think for the practical examples of the question that was raised, so NJBIA put up the New Jersey Business Coalition, which is an organization of all the business associations and the chambers of commerce. And we often send letters to government with over 100 different organizations signing on. BIA writes that letter. BIA staff are the ones following up with that letter, kind of saying, like, legislators, make sure you saw this. We're following up with the different offices. But we just have the chamber sign on. So I think it fits what you said. But I would say if there's a chamber of commerce that wants to then send it to every legislator in their area and then wants to meet with every legislator in the area to make sure that they're in agreement with what was asked for in the letter, I think that probably triggers lobbying and being a government affairs agent more so than just signing on to the letter. I think signing on to the letter, I think exactly as Rebecca laid out, is different and falls in with sort of some of the examples here with attending the events. I think many of our chambers attend some BIA events where we have legislators, executive branch officials there, and they're not speaking. They're not necessarily cornering that legislator when they walk off the stage and saying, vote for S2100 or don't vote for A5200. They're not necessarily there other than just learning and listening. And same thing, I think these letters are just putting their name as part of the business coalition, the business community in New Jersey at large. I think that's where it's like, doesn't trigger, but then once you start doing it on your own and maybe spending more than 20 hours on it on your own, and some of the chambers in our state do, and some of the chambers don't, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. And you could be a great business advocate either way. But I think again, it's fact sensitive, as Rebecca said, but I think in general, signing on to those letters, no. But if you're going to then forward that letter and meet with people about that letter and then ask for certain things, and have a whole campaign about what's in that letter for your local legislators, that changes things.
No, I think that's a perfect example. And I think that what you find also in this whole area, there's certain guidance that's very clear. There are a lot of areas where there's just no guidance, and I think a lot of times a question hasn't been asked. So I think from a perspective of compliance, if you approach things in a reasonable and well thought out way, and also just keep records, you don't have to go crazy about why you made a decision. So in the example that was just given, our chamber, our group just signed on to BIA's letter. We're part of the coalition. That's all we did. We're not treating this as lobbying. I think if a question came up, that would be reasonable. Certainly in Chris's example, if you start doing more with that and on your own, not so reasonable anymore. So I think too, it's, good faith efforts to comply and to understand, particularly when there's gray. Next slide, please. So lobbying through NJBIA. So, part of, I think, the subheading for this program was the power of advocacy and how lobbying shapes policies impacting business. I think, it's very clear we're living in very quickly changing times on the national level, the state level. Obviously, we're moving into a gubernatorial election. We're in the middle of all of that. And that's all politics and elections. But policies obviously become a big part of campaigns. Policies become a big part of government. And, you may be thinking, how do these policies affect me? How do they affect my business? How do they affect my industry? And as we talked about early on, is many businesses want to be heard, but don't necessarily want to be standing out there on their own, and really prefer to lobby through a group, whether that's an industry group, a business group, and Chris talked about how NJBIA represents businesses in all different industries. There's something, I think, to be said about standing together collectively and as a coalition, and it doesn't really put one business out on the line. Now, as I think is very clear to all of you through your experience, the program today, and through my experience over the years and working with NJBIA, they have an extremely dedicated and effective lobbying team. Chris talked about the fact that they often lead coalitions, and I've witnessed many of those over the years. Sometimes NJBIA may be focused on something, maybe a chamber is focused on something, another trade group is focused on something, but then when there are issues that more globally or broadly affect, different groups, you can form together and lead coalitions. And NJBIA has really done a great job at that over the years. And I think that joining together through a collective effort, you'll find it often does have a greater impact than one company standing on its own. So as you're also thinking about today, what are next steps? What is our company thinking about doing? Do we need to register somebody? Do we have to update policies? Or if you're listening to all of this and think, I'm happy, I'm informed, but I don't really want to jump in, but maybe you want to get more involved in NJBIA and learn about how some of your concerns can then be filtered, through NJBIA's strategy. So that's sort of thinking about lobbying and all of the compliance tips that I give you in a practical way. And we're going to move to the next slide where I'm going to turn it back over to Chris.
And just one point on before I jump into our examples on the coalitions. I do encourage you. Thank you all for being on this webinar, and thank you for attending any BIA events through the years. The one thing that I also think is very helpful to get involved in our coalitions and learn more about what we're doing is we have quarterly policy committees. And so there's an employment and labor policy committee, there's a workforce and education policy committee, and those meetings often might be the starting point or the originator for some of the coalitions that we have. And I know Elissa Frank is doing a fantastic job on the heat stress bill that has been moving a little bit in the legislature. Hopefully it doesn't move anymore. It would be a very bad bill for a lot of businesses out there because I think it's poorly drafted, not poorly intended, but poorly drafted. But there's a large coalition, and there might be a business person, not a registered government affairs agent, not a lobbyist, but a just random business person that might say, oh, wow, this would be really devastating to my business. And I learn about it at the labor policy committee that Elissa talked about. And then I'm part of the coalition. I by no means get anywhere close to 20 hours, but maybe Elissa certainly spent more than 20 hours on this bill. But maybe you can talk about how, hey, the back room, the kitchen, the outside work we do sometimes gets a little warm, and this is what this bill would do to my business model. And that's going to help shape Elissa's lobbying on it, and then ultimately maybe make it into an amendment for the bill, or make it into something that we use to as talking points for the bill, and maybe help kill the bill because of your good example. But your example doesn't necessarily get to 20 hours, make you a registered government affairs agent. but your participation is helpful. And so I think those coalitions, certainly we at BIA are spending more than 20 hours in certain coalitions that we have, but I think it's a chance for you to participate and be heard and express your opinion and be part of the democratic process, but not actually be a lobbyist. And ultimately, if it's something that's so important to your business and, oh, this would wipe us out, maybe you hire a lobbyist, maybe you do a little more, maybe you do more than 20 hours on your own, and that changes things. But there's a lot of, through the power of the coalitions that we have, a lot of ways to get involved and have us do the lobbying for you. To close out, I thought it would be very helpful to go through some examples that BIA has had in recent years or continues to have, just so you kind of see some of the things that we think about in context of the rules that Rebecca went through very well. And so first up, I mentioned this already, the annual state budget. We are in the middle of the budget process. The governor proposes our annual state budget the last Tuesday in February, and then constitutionally, New Jersey State Constitution, that budget must be signed before the end of June. So by June 30th at midnight, or else technically we're supposed to shut down the state. This is a very long process. The budget bill is the most important bill every single year that we do in the state of New Jersey per our state election law enforcement commission. It's the most lobbied issue of the year. BIA probably spends more time on it than anything else over the course of the year. Sometimes there's things within the budget, like last year, there was a massive corporate business tax increase embedded in the budget. And so we were lobbying on both the corporate tax increase, which I'll get to in a second, and then the state budget. And so whether it's presentations, testifying to the budget committee at the front end of the process, meetings with legislators around the state, go on a road show, and we're going up and down the state, North Jersey, South Jersey, just to explain our position on that budget. It takes a lot of time, BIA. There's a lot of research we put in, a lot of research our interns put in. And so that is a giant part of our lobbying every single year. And it's one where we try to use every lever of change. We're doing op-eds. It's part of the ELC talking points that we have, meeting with legislators, sending letters. So all of that, but that's kind of an every year ongoing thing. Corporate business taxes, I want to give a couple examples. So 2023, we were successful in actually getting a corporate business tax reform bill done that we wanted to get done. We had been advocating for a few changes to our corporate business tax for several years, and the Division of Taxation staff actually approached BIA and said, hey, there's some things we want to do to reform our CBT process. There's things that we know from your lobbying that you want to do. Can we work together and try to find a compromise bill that's a win-win and get that done? And so we worked on months and months and months where the BIA Chamber Joint Tax Committee worked with the experts at Division of Taxation on corporate tax issues and eventually came up with this compromise bill. We then gave it to the chairs of the legislative budget committees, Senator Sarlo in the Senate and Summerlin Pinter-Marin in the Assembly, and had this bill move in conjunction with the 2023, I guess it wasn't 2023, but FY24 state budget. And so we've got a massive tax change that got through the legislature because the executive branch approached us because they saw our success in kind of the grassroots and education and op-eds and pushing it over the years. And they knew that we had expertise. They knew that we had a coalition to back us up. And we knew that we had success in getting some things done through the legislature. So we worked together with them. It's a lot easier to work with the executive branch and the legislature than to oppose them, but got this done. But the process involved a lot of back and forth with making sure BIA's members were in a good place on the bill and making sure they had a consensus, making sure taxation, anytime we wanted to make a change, they want to make a change, and then selling all that to the legislature. And then ultimately, once it becomes a legislative bill, there were other people that got involved that wanted to ask for things outside of BIA's coalition. And I think the legislators did a nice job making sure we stuck to, because we had the business community and the executive branch treasury were on board. So we didn't want to go deviate from that too much. So we got a very complicated bill that had hundreds of millions of dollars going back and forth between the state and businesses. Some of it massive tax cuts, some of it some tax increases, but all in all, I think it was a good bill for New Jersey. So that was, I think, a victory in 2023. Last year, I say defeat because We had a massive corporate tax increase go through. It was $1 billion corporate tax increase, bringing us to 11.5%, the highest rate in the nation. BIA had been pushing for a while the expiration of the temporary tax that we had. It did expire for a short amount of time until it came back up in the budget process. But we spent months, and a lot of businesses approached BIA to, hey, can we start a coalition, start a campaign? We don't want to be out front on this issue to explain Treasury all the concerns we have with it, but we wanted, through you, have a campaign to explain why a CBT increase and having the highest in the nation is bad for business. And so we had a campaign. There was a lot of communications aspects to the campaign, a lot of press, TV, op-eds, meetings all over the state, having ads and such. It was definitely more of a campaign than anything we've done in a long time. Ultimately, the bill became law, but we were successful in at least convincing legislators to make it temporary. And so that mitigation helped, and it was a big victory for some corporations that had to pay this, and it helped them. But to some, we still lost because we have the highest corporate tax in the nation. So I think it's an example of not always getting what you want, but sometimes still softening a bad bill and making it a little bit better. And this process helped make that happen. And I mentioned right now, I'm working on follow-up regulations to the new CBT law, and putting together a letter on behalf of the BIA Chamber Joint Tax Committee, and sending to taxation soon on that. But in the middle of all these different, very in the weeds CBT issues. Wanted to bring up a very positive example of lobbying. A couple of years ago, we were successful in reforming the teen worker process in New Jersey. New Jersey had a very antiquated, that I think went back to the mid 20th century, maybe 1940s, if I remember right, process to allow teens to work in the state of New Jersey, where they literally needed a note from their principal and a note from their pediatrician to let them get a job in New Jersey. We reformed a lot of that. We made it a lot easier. We put it online. There's now a portal. The system is much better. This idea came from a BIA member in the and so the good idea from a BIA member kind of came up, bubbled up, and the BIA lobbyists were going to run with this. We then reached out to legislators that we thought were pro-business, that we thought had interest in advancing this issue from previous experience. And so we sought out the sponsors, we drafted the bill, we made some changes based upon what the sponsors saw, and then we worked the bill and got it into law. And eventually the governor signed it, and now this is a law for a couple of years that I think makes the process of having our 16 and 17-year-olds work in the state of New Jersey, which we've gone through a workforce shortage in recent years, so it was important. Another positive example where started out as more a probably government process and then turned into a statutory legislative process, and then has continued in a regulatory process. But the NJBIA Basic Skills Training Program is something that's been around now for probably 10, 15 years, and it's been a very big success, where BIA has seen thousands of its members and hundreds of thousands of their employees get trained over the years for free through money that was sitting around the Department of Labor. So years and years ago, BIA and the county colleges had an idea together that we saw money sitting around at the Department of Labor, and these training grants were going unused. They were going unused because Department of Labor had very, very stringent rules about how to give these grants out. And those stringent rules led to the money not going anywhere, and wasn't the whole point of this money that was set aside for training to actually train people. So we created this basic skills training program. We first lobbied the Department of Labor, their staff, the commissioner, the departments in the Department of Labor to move this program forward and get rid of a lot of the red tape that was there. Started being successful. And so then we went to the chairwoman of the education committees, education and higher ed committees in the legislature. And we convinced both chairwomen to sponsor a bill to codify the program so that instead of just being a program at the Department of Labor, it was now a statutory part of the Department of Labor and a commitment they had. And so we got that into law. And now the county colleges have even extended upon that again through our lobbying, where we've got money in the state budget to make sure that they're paying for this training, and also the new Pathways program that BIA and the county colleges are working on to continue to be a leader in training workforce development. So You saw it was government process, it was regulatory, it was legislative, and all of those things are obviously being reported on BIA's end, reported on the county college's end with they had a contract lobbyist at the time that was working with us, and so we're able to get this done. And then just one bullet I had, because I can't go without saying it, a lot of our lobbying time is spent stopping bad bills. And there's bills that, again, I mentioned that balance. BIA routinely sees bills that go just way too far. And we all, BIA, business community, all of you on this call, we want to protect employees and protect businesses. We want to protect the environment and protect businesses. And we see bills that lack this balance and go too far and throw the balance out of whack, which will ultimately hurt business. So we spend a lot of time just trying to mitigate, take something that was bad that we're opposing. Hey, can we get to neutral? Because if you make a couple of these changes, we won't love the bill, but it's not going to have the negative effect that we were worried about. So a lot of our time, my time, Ray's time, Alyssa's time, Althea's time is spent doing that in a bunch of different areas. And so it's hard to be the bad guy sometimes, something that sounds very well-intentioned, and they often are very well-intentioned, but to say no, to get up there and say, hey, your bill that sounds great, it's got a couple of problems here and there. So a lot of it is educating people on the problems. A lot of it is talking to the HR experts and finding out where a labor bill goes too far and is not practical. It's talking to the environmental compliance people for corporations and finding out that how that environmental bill goes too far and is not practical. And ultimately, because of our involvement, we get something that actually will protect the environment better, but do in a way that doesn't hurt business, or will protect employees better, but doesn't hurt business as much. So we're proud of that record in stopping bad bills, but a lot of our lobbying is on that. And so again, that's meeting with every legislator, meeting with the staff, educating people, seeing that a lot of times through our record and our legacy, lobbyists, legislators will reach out to one of our lobbying team and actually say, hey, I'm thinking about this bill, and we'll sit down with them and educate them on, we'll bring it to our policy committees and talk about the possibility, and then we'll bring back to the legislator the pitfalls that should be avoided. Sometimes we avoid having to actually testify against the bill because we made it better upfront. So there's a couple examples that I hopefully are helpful in just illustrating what BIA is doing every day, what BIA is doing with the guidance of great experts like Rebecca to make sure that we're following the rules and doing the right thing. All of these things are well reported and will be in our quarterly report that's going to be filed soon, and quarterly reports going forward. So I think the next couple slides just give information for Rebecca and myself. I can't endorse Rebecca and K&L Gates any more than I am about to, because they are fantastic to work with. BIA as an association and other entities that BIA has been involved with when they need counsel. I think Rebecca is the person that we strongly recommend and go to. Hopefully none of you need counsel, but if any of you are in a position where you want to clarify something, want to talk offline, I can't suggest any more going to Rebecca, because she is the best at what she does. And then lastly, I just want to say, you can contact me and the BIA team for anything. You are members of BIA. We are happy to help you, whether it's a particular policy issue or it's a question, it's a lobbying 101, anything that helps your business, please reach out. You can call or text me on my cell or my email that's listed.
So Chris, just thank you very much, you and Rebecca. Fantastic. Just a quick plug. Those policy committees that are very informative that Chris mentioned are member-only policy committees. So if you're not a member and you'd like to become a member, please reach out to Chris or myself or Danielle. We'd be happy to help you with that. Thanks again for all that you do, Rebecca and Chris and the team at NJBIA. So Chris, I don't know if you'd like to close it out with any closing remarks, or Rebecca, but thank you.
Rebecca, you have anything else you want to add?
No, I mean, I just want to say thank you for having me today. I think for everyone on this call, if you do have any questions, you have my contact information, feel free to reach out. And I would say you're also in good company. I think when it comes to lobbying and advocacy and policy work in New Jersey, like I said, there's a lot of gray. So it never hurts from a compliance perspective to really be at the front end of all of this. And, you know, some of it may vary depending on what type of organization you have, what industry you're in. So today we provided a high level, but then sometimes I think based on facts and circumstances and the nuts and bolts, there are variations, but happy to chat with anyone. I often do that for BIA members, you know, as a courtesy.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I think hopefully this was helpful to all of the BIA members that are online. I did throw in a link to NJBIA's government affairs team, so you could reach out to us through that in the chat. I also just threw in the chat, any of you interested in lobbying in government, BIA's got a Meet the Candidates for Governor dinner, the annual ELC or biannual ELC dinner coming up in June. So I put a link for that in as well. We want to be there to help you and advocate for you. So please don't ever hesitate to reach out. We want to help you. And whether it's Wayne, Danielle, and Katie that are also online, our whole team, membership, getting more involved, attending events, getting other people to be members, whatever it is, we want to be a resource for you. So please reach out. Hopefully this is helpful to you, and don't ever hesitate to reach out offline if you have specific questions that either myself or Rebecca can help with. So thank you all. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and I hope this was helpful to you. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you in the halls of the State House, or hearing from you at a BIA event, or seeing an email from you soon.
Hey, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.